So, how many of you have read the book Pilgrim's Progress?
Which one?
Pilgrim's Progress? Yeah, it's one of the classics. I think in the English language, out of every book published, it comes second to the Bible as far as how many copies it sold. So it's kind of that widespread. But in Pilgrim's Progress, the author John Bunyan describes the life of a Christian as a kind of pilgrimage, right? The Christian, the main character, is going to the celestial city. And this pilgrimage is filled with a lot of dangers and snares, and it's a long journey. And at one point in his journey to the celestial city, him and his friend Faithful, they have to go through what is called Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair is a place where it's like a city where all the emptiness and diluted grandeur of the world is paraded and sold. And so it's a place where the desires of the world are displayed and celebrated. You can get whatever you want there, any pleasure, and the emptiness of the world is there. And for John Bunyan, he represents this as the vanity and emptiness of the world that we all have to face, right? We all face in this world, even back in the 1600s when he wrote it. And I think we'd agree there's probably a lot more vanity today, we might say. The purpose of Vanity Fair in the book is to distract and weigh down pilgrims with empty pleasures and sinful lusts. Try to bring them down. And in a digital age, I think we still have to grapple with Vanity Fair. It's I think a more potent threat to our Christian lives because we now carry Vanity Fair in our pockets in so many ways. Our smartphones are little gateways to Vanity Fair. We have access to all the empty pleasures of the world that we can just find with a few taps. Mindless games, outrage, celebrity gossip, bad news of the day, entertainment in the form of watching murder, theft, adultery, every kind of sin paraded before our eyes as normal. And so our smartphones, our computers, our tablets, they all give us access to Vanity Fair like never before, and they can be very dangerous to our Christian lives. And so in a digital age, we face an onslaught of distractions. That was really the purpose of Vanity Fair, was to distract us with the empty things and the sinful things of the world. And so now as we kind of have access to these things in an even more immediate way, where you don't have to go out and seek them, you can just be in your home and having access to empty pleasures and sin, we need to talk about and think about how we can face these distractions in a biblical way. How we can learn to fight distraction, how we can remain faithful and focused on Christ and our mission as we walk through Vanity Fair, or as we walk with it in our pockets. So that's what our focus is going to be on, digital distractions. And so we're going to start, as you see in the handout, we'll talk about the just kind of issue of distraction, how we are distracted. We'll talk about how we're called to be watchful, we're called to be focused people. And then we're going to talk about how we can fight distraction as we live as Christians. So first, we see that we, as a culture, as people today, are distracted people. And our devices are a primary culprit of this distraction that we face. Most of us who use phones and stuff, we check them a lot, don't we? If you have a smartphone with access to a lot of different things, it's very tempting to check it like right when you get up in the morning to see if you have any texts or emails or just to scroll through Facebook or something. And according to one study, 54% of adults check their phone within minutes of waking up. And 73% of Christians say that they check their email or social media before they read Scripture or pray. And so when we think about this, it shows us that we are often distracted, that these devices have a pull in our lives. You can, on certain devices, you can view how much time you're actually spending on them. So they put it out there so you can see it to kind of help us not spend so much time. I don't know if it really works. But you can go to a setting and you can see your screen time, how much time you spent. And it's kind of crazy how much time we spend on our phones and our tablets and computers these days. Our devices then distract us, and they are a primary culprit of distraction. I think there's a couple reasons why digital devices especially are so distracted. There's a lot of distractions out there that don't have anything to do with your phone or social media or whatever. But digital distractions are especially so potent, one, because of the content that's on there. Our devices provide a powerful world of entertainment, information, socialization that can be hard to resist. Another reason they're so distracting are our notifications. They're constantly buzzing and beeping and calling for us to check them and look at them. And they're designed to be distracting. People who design technology design them to get as much of our attention as possible. And so they want it to be distracting because they want our attention. And as we talked about a couple weeks ago, they want our attention because that's what makes them the most money. And so we are distracted people using devices that are designed to distract us as much as possible. And now let's talk a little bit more about why these distractions are so tempting. These are 3 reasons from Tony Reinke's book, 12 Ways Your Phone is Changing You. He has a chapter called We Are Addicted to Distraction. And he gives 3 ways why digital distractions lure us. And the first is that they help us keep work away. So they help us escape pressure and responsibility for a time, right? It's easy to, especially so much work today is done on a computer for a lot of people. And so it's easy to, you're working on a project or something, and then you can jump over to YouTube and watch a funny cat video, or you can, respond to an email or a text from somebody, and you can kind of put off the responsibility of doing the work you should be doing. They also help us keep people away. They are a means that we can focus on what or who we want to focus on, not maybe the people who might need our focus or have the right to our attention. And so our devices are an easy way to kind of escape from other people, that we can kind of pull into our own little world where we can talk to who we want to, we can avoid who we want to, and we can avoid awkwardness and responsibility in relationships. They also help keep thoughts of eternity away. We're distracted often because we want to be distracted, because life in this world is complicated, and when we think about our finitude, our mortality, it's easy just to be like, okay, I don't want to think about that. And we go to entertainment, we go to distractions to kind of push these thoughts away. Because it's easier to be distracted than to come to grips with our mortality, that there is eternity awaiting us. This life is short. And so distractions are an easy escape from the most deathly serious realities of life that we don't want to deal with. They help us escape wrestling with the big questions of life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where did I come from? Where am I going? So all of these kind of reasons focus on why they're so luring, why digital distractions are so luring. They help us keep work away, people away, thoughts of eternity away. And when you put all those together, it's a very powerful combination of distraction. And while the lure might look appealing in the moment, the consequences are serious. So the consequences of digital distraction, first, we lose focus and ability to think deeply. I mean, it's kind of a definition of distraction, is not being focused. But when you're not focused, it leads to the inability to think as deeply. So Tim Challies, an author of a book called The Next Story, which is about Christians and technology, puts it this way. So distraction leads to shallow thoughts, which leads to shallow living. So when we're distracted, we aren't thinking as deeply. We aren't as focused. And to think deeply, we have to be focused. And so distractions push these things away. And so we struggle to maybe read for a solid period of time. We lose our train of thought easily. We struggle to listen to other people for a sustained amount of time. And because we don't think deeply, especially as Christians, this is important, because it causes us to struggle as we read the Bible, think deeply about our faith, and to pray. Prayer takes a lot of focus and kind of thinking as we direct our thoughts and try to focus them from all the other stuff that's going on in our minds and around us. And so we don't think deeply. We struggle to read the Bible. We struggle to pray. We struggle to think deeply about our faith. We're called to love God with our minds as well. And so loving God with our minds means we want to think deeply about God, who He is. As we think about God, we learn to love Him more. And so our distraction causes us to have shallow thoughts about God, which leads to shallow Christian living and shallow love. And so this is a serious issue, I think, because it's not just an issue if we're not focused at work, or we're not focused maybe on family, which is really important. But even deeper, we're not focused on God, and we're missing out on so much of the Christian life. We also lose the ability to deal what is going on in our hearts and minds. Distractions easily become an escape from the questions, doubts, pain, and struggles in our hearts. And so when we regularly escape from dealing with what is going on inside of us, whether it's doubts or grief or anxiety, we lose the ability to actually focus on these things and process them. And instead we just cover them up with noise, distraction. So another book that I've read some of as I've studied for this series is a book called My Tech-Wise Life. It's written by a 19-year-old named Amy Crouch. Kind of goes along with the book her dad wrote called The Tech-Wise Family. And she writes this book as a 19-year-old, and she tells a story about a time she went on a youth retreat where the focus was prayer and silence and solitude. So this was a youth group event, and they went to learn more about prayer and how to be silent before the Lord and read the Bible and things like that. And so there was an exercise during this retreat where they were told to spread out and take 10 minutes of silence to read a psalm and pray alone. So, 10 minutes, that's not a lot of time to go and just read Psalm 23 or something and then pray. So these teens were told to do it, and they did it. They come back and they talked about their experience. The response of many of them was really heartbreaking. For a lot of these teenagers, it was stressful for them to sit in quiet without their phones, without distraction. And some were even brought to tears because of how painful the experience was. Because it brought things into their lives that they hadn't been dealing with because they had been distracted so much, and they were just kind of pushing them away. They had to come to grips. They couldn't escape what was going on in their own hearts and minds during those 10 minutes. They weren't used to that. They're used to covering it up with escaping from it with constant distraction. And so I think that's a lot of young people, and not just young people even, but a lot of people today use devices to get away from dealing with what's going on in their lives. And then when there is the silence, it's difficult for them to wrestle with it. So that's a serious consequence. We lose the ability to deal with what's going on with in our hearts and minds. Third, we become sleepy to the reality of God, our souls, other people, and eternity, and our mortality. Distractions are meant to dull us to life, really. That's part of their lure. They make us shallow thinkers, as we've talked about. They also dull our hearts and minds to the things of God, the things that matter most. And like we've talked about, we don't like to be awake. We don't like to be alert to some of the difficult questions. It's easier just to push them away and turn up the noise so we don't have to think about them. But when we constantly give in to digital distraction, we become spiritual sleepwalkers. That we aren't awake to what's most important in life. Everything is a haze. Everything is a fog. And so distractions make us sleepy and lazy in our spiritual lives. We lose a desire for holiness. We lose a passion for lost people. We lose a desire to be discipled and to disciple others. We become sleepy to God, to the reality of our souls, to other people, and to eternity. And so we are distracted people, and our digital distractions are powerful and dangerous. Yet the Bible calls us to a very different way of life that is really the opposite of constant distractedness that defines our culture. We are called to watchfulness and wakefulness. This is a big emphasis in Scripture, especially in the New Testament. And we read what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 16:13. As he's summing up his letter, he says, "Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong." So to be watchful is the same as standing firm in the faith and acting courageously. It's a big part of our Christian lives. And so we're called to live focused, alert lives for Jesus. And then when we live in constant digital distraction, it's hindering this. It's hindering our watchfulness. It's hindering our wakefulness to God and what's going on in our own hearts and how Jesus has called us to live and how we are to love and respond to Him. So I want to look at 5 biblical reasons we push away unnecessary distractions and stay awake and watchful. Why, as Christians, should we be focused and wakeful and alert? Well, 1, we must stay awake and watchful because Christ is coming soon. Christ is coming soon. So we're going to kind of be turning several places in the Bible. So if you have a Bible and you want to turn with me, Mark 13, we'll kind of be going fast. We'll be reading a few verses and talking about them. But Mark chapter 13, verse 32, this is Jesus is in Jerusalem. He said this during Passion Week, during Holy Week, as he was in Jerusalem. And he talks about the destruction of the temple, signs of the end of the age. And this is what he says to his disciples, how they should live. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning. lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. So we stay awake because Christ is coming soon. No one knows the day of Christ's return, and so we watch. We're alert. We're awake. We're focused on how we're living because we want to be ready for when he comes back. And so Jesus gives this parable, too, about the doorkeeper who's not going to drowse off while he's waiting for his master to return. He wants to be awake for his master to let him in. He doesn't want to be found sleeping. And so, as Christians, we don't want to be found sleeping or drowsy when Jesus returns. We want to be awake. We want to be alert for him. Digital distractions cause us to be sleepy, as we've talked about. And so, if we want to live in light of Christ's return, we must push them away and remain awake and watchful. In Luke 21, this is kind of Luke's parallel account of what Jesus says. And he emphasizes a few different things. So in Luke 21, 34 to 36, but watch yourselves lest your hearts be weighed down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life. And that day come upon you suddenly like a trap, for it will come upon all who dwell on the face of the whole earth. But stay awake at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are going to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. So Jesus calls us to watch ourselves so that our hearts don't become weighed down. And the language he uses is interesting. The verb that he uses, weighed down or heavy, is used in other contexts for like heavy eyes, physical sleepiness. So it's used of the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane when they're trying to stay awake and pray with Jesus. It says they had heavy eyes. It's the same word that's used here. That we don't want to be weighed down. We don't want to become sleepy with these things. So we shouldn't have a sleepy, drowsy heart. We shouldn't be sleepy spiritually, is what he's saying. And then he says, what makes our hearts drowsy? Well, dissipation. So the results of heavy drinking, the word can refer to like a hangover, headache, fuzziness of mind, drunkenness, overconsumption of alcohol, which is often used as an escape. It dulls us to life. And the anxieties of life, constantly worrying about the things of this world. And I think digital distractions have a similar function and result in our lives. One, that they give us, in a sense, a digital hangover and headaches that make us fuzzy to the world. And I'm not sure if any of you have ever done this, but if you've ever binge watched something, where you spent 5 hours watching a show or something, you come away from that, you don't feel great. It's easy to do, but you don't feel great. I mean, I speak from experience here. You kind of have a headache. You kind of feel tired and dull and drowsy. You just don't feel great. It's kind of like a digital hangover. Digital distractions, they dull us to the world. They're a form of escape from feeling. Some people turn to alcohol to escape. Some people turn to Instagram or Twitter or other forms of video games, things like that, to escape responsibilities in life. And they also amplify up anxiety about life in the world. We're anxious about things. We talked about we've talked about this a little bit in other talks about how social media and other digital technologies tend to amp up the anxieties we feel because they expose us to negative content, or they expose us to we're looking at the world and everyone just seems so perfect online and we're not. But they cause us to be more anxious. And so if we want to remain awake and alert, ready for Jesus to come back, we need to refuse to give in to digital distraction because they numb us, they dull us, they make us sleepy. Second, we must stay awake and watchful because Christ has given us a mission. So we turn over to Matthew. This is Matthew's parallel account from what we've just read in Mark and Luke. And Matthew says this, or Jesus says this in Matthew 24, starting in verse 42. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have left his house to be broken into. Therefore you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you don't expect. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master set over his household, to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom the master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all of his possessions. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and begins to beat the fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come at a day he doesn't expect him, in an hour he doesn't know, and he will cut him to pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that day there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So in this parallel passage, we get more of Jesus' words about the servant and the master, this parable that he tells. And he said, not only should we remain watchful because Jesus is coming soon, but until he returns, we're servants and we've been given a job to do. But we shouldn't abuse the job we've been given, right? Like the servant who, he doesn't think his master's coming anytime soon, so he starts doing stuff he shouldn't be, beating other people and eating and drinking probably his master's food and all these different things. And so part of the point is that we stay awake and watchful because we have a mission. We have a job to do. We're servants of Christ, and we want to be found doing what he's given us to do when he comes back. We want to be found being his servant, carrying out his mission, doing his work on earth till he comes back. And we know from the rest of the New Testament that this mission is ultimately making disciples of all nations, as Jesus spells out in the Great Commission in Matthew 28. And digital distractions make us sleepy to this mission. They lull us into thinking, I can do that tomorrow, or I can kind of just ignore it. Other people will do that. Or I can get away with just doing a little bit online, sharing a Bible verse, and I've completed the mission. And so we must remain awake and alert because we don't want to drift away from the mission Jesus has given us. Third, we must stay awake and watchful because our hearts are prone to wander. 1 Timothy 4:16, Paul writes to Timothy, and he says, keep a close watch on yourself and on be watchful. Persist in this, for by so doing you will save both yourself and your hearers. So Timothy, as a pastor, was called to watch himself in his teaching, to pay attention to where his heart was at and what he was teaching. So pay attention to his own life, how he was living, thinking, feeling, and also what he was teaching. And this meant that he regularly had to take stock of his heart and his actions, his attitudes and motives, his thoughts and affections. And if he did this, Paul says, you're going to save yourself and your hearers. That's pretty strong language. I don't think he's saying that you're going to save them, spiritually in the sense that, you're going to purchase their salvation. But what he does mean is you're going to save yourself and them from wandering from the truth. Because the implication is, if you don't keep a watch on yourself and your teaching, you're going to wander, and that's going to cause the people to wander. And so Timothy needed to take great pains to watch his life, to be awake and watchful to what he was thinking, feeling, doing, and saying, and keep it in accordance with the gospel of Christ. And it's not just pastors who need to do this, it's all of Christians, because we are all prone to wander, as the hymn says, and we must pay attention to our hearts. And in Hebrews, we have a similar idea here in chapter 2, verse 1, where the author of Hebrews writes, therefore we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. Christians must not grow lazy with what we believe, the author is saying. We must pay more attention to the message of the gospel. The recipients of this letter were facing the temptation to drift back into Judaism and some of the practices away from the gospel. And the author says, we got to pay attention to what we believe. And that's what the book is about, paying attention to the gospel, who Jesus is, what it means to walk by faith, how to live for Christ and not give up no matter what. And if we don't do this, if we grow lazy with what we believe and we don't pay much closer attention to what we've heard and believe, then we're going to drift away. Living the Christian life isn't something we drift into. It's something that's focused. We have to remain watchful and stay in it. That's part of the Spirit's work in our life, is to keep us in the faith so that we persevere. And so digital distractions then hinder our watchfulness and wakefulness. And since they hinder us from staying awake, they also lead us to wander, to drift away. We're not careful. Number 4, we must stay awake and watchful because Satan wants to devour us. 1 Peter 5:8, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. The devil is our enemy. He's just waiting to pounce. He's waiting for us to be distracted and not focused, so he can pounce on us and devour us. And so we have to be watchful and awake lest we invite him to devour us. We must be ready to take up our weapons of spiritual warfare and fight back when he does attack. And if digital distractions dull our hearts and minds and make us sleepy, we're going to be easy pickings for the enemy. And so we must stay awake and watchful because Satan wants to devour us. He wants us distracted because that makes us easy prey. 5th reason we must stay awake and watchful is because we need to hear from Jesus. So the well-known story of Luke chapter 10, we'll read it, Martha and Mary and Jesus. So Luke 10:38. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who was at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving. And she went up to him and said, Lord, do you not care if my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Luke says that Martha was distracted with her serving. And this is really, from my research and search in the Bible, is this is the one place that the word distracted is used in the Bible. And Mary is distracted by serving Jesus, by a good thing, right? She wants to serve Jesus. She wants to prepare a good meal for him and have everything ready for him and his followers. And she's distracted by it. She's missing out on something better. And the word here, it means to be pulled away from something. That's what this Greek word means. It means to be pulled away from something to something inferior. And so that's, I think, a good definition of distraction. It's being pulled away from something by something inferior. Martha's attention wasn't where it should be. She was serving Jesus, which is better than playing Angry Birds on an iPad or watching YouTube or something. She was making food for Jesus, but it still was a distraction from something better. And her distraction led to anxiety. Jesus said, you're anxious about many things. Distraction was caught up with her anxiety, which led her to miss out on the one thing necessary, which was to sit at the feet of Jesus, listening to what Mary was doing. That's the good portion. The good portion is listening to Jesus, knowing him, having a relationship with him. We're called to serve him, and we're called to action. It's not just kind of this passive thing where we just sit back. But the good portion is knowing Jesus. It's listening to him and following him. And so digital distraction often do the same thing for us that Martha was struggling with on a much shallower level. They hinder us from listening to Jesus and sitting at his feet. If hustling about to make dinner for Jesus distracted Martha from listening, then what can we say about the Vanity Fairs in our pockets? What they're doing to our listening to Jesus? Because the pull of text, email, games, social media, whatever, pulls us away from the one thing necessary, sitting at Jesus' feet. I think that's why digital tech is a culprit, a common culprit from distracting us from spending time with the Lord each day. I think if you asked a lot of people, how much time did you spend on this, or your phone, or doing this, how much time did you spend with the Lord, listening from Jesus, you'd have a pretty big imbalance there. Because it's hard to read the Bible sometimes, and it's hard to kind of devote and be disciplined in that. It's easy to pull out a distraction, whatever it is. And so we need to remain watchful and alert and guard ourselves from digital distractions, because we need to hear from Jesus. We need to stay awake. We need to not be lured in by these things. And the call of Scripture is clear. We must remain watchful. We must remain awake. We must not let our hearts be weighed down by digital distractions to pull us away from following Jesus and his calling on our lives. And so I think we've hammered home the reality that we are distracted and what the consequences of that are, and then what Scripture is clear about, that we must be undistracted and watchful in our Christian lives. Now we kind of get into the how. We must learn to fight distraction. So a few things here. You'll see 3 different areas. First, we must recognize that some distractions are good, are inevitable. Some are holy, we might call holy distractions. We shouldn't think that all distractions are created equal. Right? Some distractions are God's way of pulling us from something we're doing, something better he has for us. Like that's what I'm calling holy distractions here. We see this in the life of Jesus in Matthew chapter 14, verse 13. When Jesus heard this, he just heard that John the Baptist has been executed by Herod. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So Jesus is trying to get away from the crowd. He's trying to have some time to himself and with his disciples. Other gospel accounts talk about how the disciples have just come back from their mission and going out and preaching in other towns. They've come back and Jesus has heard what's happened to John. He says, let's go rest for a while. Well, what happens? He comes ashore from the boat. There's this huge crowd there. He could have looked at this as a distraction from what he wanted to do, which was rest and pray and recharge, you could say. But he doesn't. He has compassion on the people. Something like that would frustrate me, but for Jesus, it's an opportunity for him to love and to teach and to feed 5,000 people. And so that, I think we could call a kind of holy distraction. Something God puts in our path that we weren't planning on, and it kind of distracts us from what we originally intended to do. But it probably can't be avoided, or two, it's God's plan, what he wants us to do. And a lot of times that's not going to be a digital distraction. It's going to be something else in our life, a person in need. Other distractions are just part of life and can't be avoided, whether it's work or family life, different distractions we could talk about there. Other distractions, though, the ones we're focusing on, are avoidable. The ones we want to fight are the ones that are hindering us from focusing, hindering us from our life with Jesus. There's other distractions that we could avoid, but aren't necessarily doing that. They're not necessarily hindering us from focus, like watching a show before you go to bed, or reading a blog article, or something digital like that. That's kind of a distraction, but it's not pulling you away. It's not something you're giving your life to. It's not distracting you from reading the Bible or for loving people or coming to church or things like that. And so the distractions we're focusing on here are the distractions that are avoidable if we're intentional, the ones that pull us away from what matters most. These are the distractions we must fight, and we fight them first by maximizing our focus on what matters most and is most captivating. And so we first maximize our focus on Jesus, becoming captivated with his glory. I think part of why we are so distracted by devices is because they captivate us with a kind of glory, a kind of visual wow factor that keeps us coming back for more. But when we think about it, these pale in comparison with Jesus and his glory. And so I want to spend just a minute talking about the glory of Jesus, what that means. It's kind of a phrase that sounds churchy. Might not mean a ton to us when we hear it, because it's just almost might sound cliche, the glory of Jesus. What do we mean by that? Well, first, I think we have to recognize that the gospel message is the good news that displays Jesus' glory. It's the good news and the glory of Jesus Christ, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4:4. He calls the gospel the good news of the glory of Christ. Glory, the word glory, fundamentally means pure brightness, radiance, light. It's what captures our eyes, but also wants us to shield our eyes at times. Glory, especially in the Old Testament, is also associated with weightiness. That's what the Hebrew word is associated with, the word for weightiness. It's what makes Jesus worthy of awe and respect. He's not to be taken lightly. And so we kind of have these twin ideas here of brightness and weightiness that come together in a biblical definition of glory, the glory of God. And so we can say that the glory of Jesus is the brightness, the weightiness of who he is and what he's done. It's what captures our hearts and minds and makes us feel a weighty respect and awe and love and joy. It's the radiance of his love, the awe-inspiring weightiness of his holiness. And we see his glory most clearly in the gospel. Seeing the glory of Jesus, it's like looking at the sun. It's blindingly bright, but it lights up our world. It's like looking at the stars on a clear night. It's shining and awe-inspiring. And so we see the glory of Jesus. Right now we see it by faith as we study God's word. And one day we're going to see it by sight. Right? We see it by faith now as we trust that this is who Jesus is, as we read about him in his word. And one day we will behold him. We will see him. And we will be like him. We will see him for we shall see him as he is, as John writes in 1 John. And so we see the glory of Jesus now by faith and by looking at his word. And so it takes effort. It takes time to meditate on who he is. I think in our culture today, even Christian culture, we struggle to think deeply about who Jesus is, what he has done. Actually take time to just think about that. We talk about it a lot, and we have various phrases and sometimes even cliches, but how much time do we actually spend just meditating on his perfect character, who he is, and apply that to our hearts and to our lives? And it takes effort. It takes the work of the Spirit as well to open our eyes to taste and see something of Jesus' glory by faith, to be satisfied with his glory, of who he is. And only a sight of Jesus' glory in the end is going to satisfy our hearts and bring us true peace. If we want to be satisfied, we need to know the glory of Jesus. So John Owen, who is an old theologian from 1600s, he wrote, "Only a sight of Jesus' glory and nothing else will truly satisfy God's people." He wrote a whole book called The Glory of Christ. Short, the abridged, at least the abridged one that I have is short. But in this he writes early on that it's only a sight of Jesus' glory. Nothing else is really good. If you're truly a part of God's people, only knowing Jesus' glory, who he is going to satisfy us. And he goes on to say, "By beholding the glory of Christ by faith, we shall find rest to our souls. Our minds are apt to be filled with troubles, fears, cares, dangers, distresses, ungoverned passions, and lusts. By these our thoughts are filled with chaos, darkness, and confusion. But where the soul is fixed on the glory of Christ, then the mind finds rest and peace. For to be spiritually minded is peace." Romans 8:6. And so if we want to fight distraction, if we want to be satisfied with Christ, and as we're watchful and seek to live the Christian life, we must be captivated with the glory of Christ. I think it's also important that we point out that if we want to fight distraction, we're going to fail if we just minimize distraction. That's why I put kind of this part first, that we maximize our focus. Because if we just focus on minimizing the distractions, we have nothing we're trying to focus on, we're not going to get anywhere. The distractions are just going to keep pulling us away. And so we have to start by seeking every day to be more captivated by Jesus and his glory than the puny glories of the digital world. That we come to see him as glorious every day, and the digital distractions is nothing compared to him. And that's what you see in Pilgrim's Progress is Christian and faithful are walking through Vanity Fair. None of it really draws them because they are satisfied with Christ. That his glory has captivated them. And the people don't really understand why they're not willing to buy the stuff there, or why the language they speak, they say, is even different, because people can't understand what they're talking about because they speak the language of Zion. They just have a totally different perspective on the world, and the vanity of the world, the distractions, don't pull them away from Christ. We also need to maximize our focus by recognizing God's call on our lives. So as we are captivated by Jesus and his glory, we focus on how he's called us to live. That individually, God has given each of us callings, ways we live our lives, ways we want to love others and honor him, whether it's a vocation, whether it's even a hobby, whether it's a ministry, whether it's in our relationships. We all have callings in our lives. So one of my callings, I'm a pastor, but I'm also a husband and a father. And so these are callings in my life that I need to focus on, and how I can honor God and love others through these callings. And we fight distraction by being laser focused on our callings and recognizing their importance, that they're from God. God has given me this. God has called me to be a faithful husband and father and pastor. And so I need to focus on these things. And when I focus on them and I realize their importance from God, it's going to help me fight the distractions, because I know what's truly important and valuable. And so spending an afternoon playing video games instead of playing with my daughters is a poor choice, because I'm focused on my calling, and I want to love my daughters well and not be distracted from serving them. As Christians, we're also called soldiers, right? We're soldiers of Christ, and soldiers focus on the mission in the battle. They don't get pulled away, as Paul writes, by civilian pursuits. They don't get pulled away by the distractions of the world. That we focus on the mission as soldiers. We seek the lost and disciple fellow believers. We love one another. We do battle against evil in our own hearts and in the world. We're also called pilgrims as Christians. And so we focus on our calling, and that we focus on what we're called to, our destination. We fix our eyes on Jesus and the life that he's promised us with him in new creation. And that the destination should prove great enough to make distractions seem trivial. We think about where we're headed, the calling God has placed on our lives, where we're going. It should make all the little distractions in the world look worthless in comparison to the glory that will be revealed in us. And so, when we give ourselves to focus on our calling, our mission, our destination, we fight distraction. These things, being focused on these things and pouring ourselves into them as given by God, helps us to realize just the trivial nature, the vain nature of the distractions. Third, we maximize our focus by being watchful over our hearts. As we've seen, distractions help us escape paying attention to what's going on in our lives. And that the story from the youth group retreat where the kids struggle to deal with their lives, we often use distractions as an escape. We've also seen that being watchful is vital because we're prone to wander. And we can easily fool ourselves into thinking we're okay. So we kind of have these two ideas that one, distractions help us escape, and distractions help us wander. And so we fight distraction by making a daily habit to pay attention to our hearts. That we're going to take time for quiet and for space to think about what we're going with. And we ask, what's going on in my heart? What are my thoughts directed to? Where's my focus? And so we have time every day for silence and reflection on God's Word in our lives. And so I think a key part of fighting distraction is purposefully setting aside regular time to focus on God and our relationship with Him. And so I think that's a big hindrance of digital distractions, that they keep us from this quiet that we need. And so we maximize our focus by setting aside the time to take watch over our heart. So we fight distraction first by maximizing focus, and then I think we do take time as much as possible to minimize the distractions themselves. So again, we want to maximize our focus first, because then this next section won't mean anything if we don't do first. We're not captivated by the glory of Jesus, just getting off social media or something and doing something else isn't necessarily going to do us a lot of good as Christians. And so we must take advantage of practical ways to minimize distractions. And so these 4 areas are, again, based off from Tim Challies in his book, The Next Story, and these are his 4 practical steps to minimizing distraction. First, discover distraction. First, we have to know what distracts us, because not all of us are distracted by the same things. We're distracted by various things, whether it's online, or maybe what you're distracted by isn't online. Like Martha, she was distracted by something good. Good things can distract us too from what matter. And so first we need to, what distracts me? What keeps me from centering my focus on Jesus and living for Him and the callings He's put on my life? What is distracting me? And you're talking about digital things, or even if it's not digital, you track what you're doing and where your thoughts are at. So, if it's a device and something on there that distracts you, you can track how much you're using it and what you're doing. You can write down what apps you're using or websites you visit often and how long you're using them. And you can monitor how many distracting notifications you're getting every day, and really just ask, what is distracting me? What is dulling me to God in the world instead of sharpening me to God? And it helps to write this out, I think, too. Ask, how am I spending my time? You're writing it down. What apps or what is pulling me away from something better? And what is making me sleepy to the things of God? We're writing these things down and asking ourselves, what is distracting me? Second, we then try to destroy the distraction, get rid of the distraction. Once you identify it, you find an effective way to demolish it. And so there's some suggestions here would be, if it's an app on your phone or computer or whatever that's distracting you, you just get rid of it. Just delete it. If you don't need it, if it's a pointless distraction, one way to demolish it is to get it out of your digital world and just delete it or get rid of it. Whether if it's social media, you get rid of the app and maybe only use it on a web browser, so it's harder to get to. You create when you pull out your phone or your tablet, you have your home screen. You can make that so if there's a certain thing that distracts you on that, you put that outside of your main home screen, so it's harder to get to. Create a little bit of friction is a good way to fight distraction. Make it harder to do the distracting thing in some way. And a lot of phones today and computers and tablets, they have features you can use if you're intentional to disable certain websites or certain apps for certain times or make a limit on how much time you can spend on them. Then it'll kick you out, and you have to enter a password. And so if you give that password to somebody else and you don't know it, then you can't get back on. There's things like that you could do. You could turn off some of the notifications. Turn it actually back into a phone instead of getting a lot of people, they get notifications about maybe games they're playing or social media notifications and email and all these other things. But it's really easy just to say no, turn off the notifications. And so that's one thing I've done. One way I try to fight distraction is the only things that I get notified about really on here are things, phone calls, texts, and calendar like reminders. Those are the things I've turned on. I want this to be a phone mainly when I'm getting notified. If I want something to ring, I want it to be a phone call or a text or something like that. And there's a lot of options out there I have it set up so there's certain times where I won't get notifications from everybody. I only get notifications from maybe Laura or family, and then I have to go, I'll check my notifications. If it's a text or something, if you call me, it'll always go through. But if you text me, it might take me a minute to get it because I might, if I'm spending time with my family, it might not go off. So you can set up things like, I think that is one good thing that people are realizing, okay, these are distracting. How can we set up things on the devices themselves to help counter those? And so really it just takes kind of creativity. You identify the distraction, then you get creative about destroying it. Then you cultivate concentration. And we've talked about this a little bit already about maximizing our focus, but a couple other points here. One, we cultivate concentration by just committing fewer things to focus on. As we talked about a few weeks ago, a lot of the lure of our devices too is this idea of multitasking. That we do a lot of different things at once. And when we decide that, okay, we're going to focus on one thing at a time as much as possible, and that will help when we commit to fewer things to focus on at one time. And we can do this maybe even just one day where we say, okay, I want to focus on one thing today. I want to make one highlight that I hope I do today. And that's going to be the main thing I focus on. And I'm going to do other things, but I'm going to have one thing to focus on today. And that'll help kind of eliminate distractions. When you write down, okay, today my highlight is I'm going to preach this Sunday morning. I could write that down. That's going to be a main focus of my day. And when I'm focused on my highlight, my main thing I want to focus on, it'll help me stay focused and put away the distractions. Another way we cultivate concentration, I think, is by reading and writing. Reading books is a way that kind of builds up our concentration. When we read, it requires us to be focused, because if you look away, you're not going to be reading anymore. You have to follow the words on the page. By definition, reading requires focus, and so we cultivate concentration by reading and by writing as well. Reading and writing for solid chunks of time is like working out your focus muscles. We go to the gym and you lift weights or you run, you work out your muscles that way. Reading and writing is like exercise for your brain. So that's one way to cultivate focus. And then finally, seek solitude. Have regular times when you are disconnected. So a great way to fight digital distractions is just to have digital free times where you're not going to be distracted by them. And you can do this, what's recommended in Tim Challies' book and in other books that I've read and think is a good practice, is that kind of three areas. You have a digital free time every day where maybe it's dinner time, where you put your phone away. You hear it if it rings or something, but it's out of sight. Or maybe you do just turn it off for an hour, turn off the TV or music, and you just spend an hour or so disconnected. And for a lot of people and families today, that's kind of a radical idea, which is crazy to think how far we've come in our digital age. Just the fact that putting away your phone for dinner or turning off the TV or the music at dinner time is a radical idea for some people. So take a digital free time each day. Take a digital Sabbath each week where for one day you maybe turn off some of the notifications on your phone, or some people I've read, they turn off their phone for one day. And if you could do that, great. I don't think most people probably can't do that today. But take a day where at least you're not going to do what most distracts you. Maybe you're going to take a Sabbath from a certain technology. But A great thing to do is just take Sunday as a digital Sabbath, where maybe you're going to not watch shows maybe that you normally watch, and you use that time to read the Bible or to read another book, and you just take a break from some of the digital things we focus on so much. And then one last suggestion is take a digital vacation every year. So take a trip, commit to take time to actually rest and silence your device and take a week from kind of the noise of the digital world. So those are some ideas for minimizing distractions, for fighting distraction, and ultimately we maximize our focus on what matters most, and then we minimize the pull of the distractions. And the point of it all is that we're watchful, we're ready for Jesus to come back. We want to be doing what he's given us to do as we live as Christians in a digital age. Because the digital distractions are all around us. They pull us away from other things that matter. They're not going away. They're not going away. And I think young people growing up today, myself included, there's a big pull from these distractions to pull us away from our relationship with God, with other people, our families, and the work God has given us to do. And so we need to regain the biblical emphasis on watchfulness and focus and learn how to minimize these distractions and focus on the glory of Christ, his call in our lives, what's going on in our hearts. And as we do this, hopefully we regain some focus as we spend time with God each day and seek to live for him. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for Christ. We thank you for the gospel and how it points us to his glory. Lord, I just pray for each of us that we would seek to maximize our focus on Christ and his call in our lives, that we would follow him faithfully. Lord, that we would seek to use digital technology for your glory, use it to love people and encourage people, and to maybe even use it to study your word, but Lord, we wouldn't use it to just be constantly distracted. So Lord, help us, I pray, in Jesus' name.